What's happening, fight fans? Ryan Thomas here, live on the Thomas Take Sports podcast for this monthly prediction video. Now, these are monthly UFC event prediction videos that you guys know I've always put out. Those of you that have followed me for the last few years, you guys know that every big UFC pay-per-view, I'm on here discussing my predictions for the big fights, the main card fights. There are a ton of main card fights on this UFC 266 card that I am very excited for. Of course, one more than the other. I'll get to that in a little bit. But UFC 266 this Saturday, you got Alexander Volkanovski, UFC featherweight champion, versus Brian T. City Ortega. Ortega taking his second crack at a UFC featherweight title. And then in the co-main event, you have a women's flyweight champion, the Bullet, one of the baddest females on the planet outside of Amanda Nunes, of course, Valentina, the Bullet Shivchenko. She's taking on Lauren Murphy, looking to defend her title one more time as Shivchenko. And then, of course, a fight that's 17 years in the making, the Nick Diaz versus Robbie Lawler rematch. As well, Jairzinho Rosenstroke versus Curtis Blades, as well as Cynthia Calvillo taking on Jessica Andraj. That's the main card for UFC 266, which takes place this Saturday night on ESPN Plus pay-per-view. Folks, in this episode of the Thomas Take Sports Podcast, I'll be giving you my predictions, my breakdowns of each and every main card fight on the UFC 266 card. So with that being said, let's get right to it. So the next fight that the first fight I should say that I want to talk about is Jessica Andraj versus Cynthia Calvillo. Of course, Andraj is a former title contender. This is a women's flyweight fight, but Andraj has been a contender and a former champion. She knocked out Rose Namajunas about a year and a half, 2 years ago. Now making this flyweight fight. She's coming off a loss, of course, in her own right. And Cynthia Calvillo, 9-2-1, 34 years old. The clock is ticking for her. We rarely see women fight into an older age. It's tougher for women to cut weight, especially from 125 to even 115 as they get older. It's tougher for any fighter to cut weight, man or woman. But Cynthia Calvillo, she's got a real opportunity as far as this upcoming fight to take on a Jessica Andraj, somebody that I believe is a tough competitor. If Andraj gets back in the win column, we could easily see Andraj fighting for a title shot once again. That division's kind of thin, especially the division that has Valentina Shivchenko as the champion, where she's just virtually cleaned out the entire weight class at the UFC women's flyweight division. I'm excited to see what happens next within that time frame of having Andraj win this fight or Calvillo win this fight. If Calvillo wins this fight, she's obviously a new contender in that division. She's someone that is fresh. She's someone that, I think a lot of us thought very highly of, but she's kind of been away from the fight game for a little while, even predating the COVID-19 pandemic. So to get her back in there against Jessica Andraj, I think is very important. It's a very important fight for her. It's a very important fight for Andraj to get back in the win column. I love the matchmaking here, but Jessica Andraj is a massive 115-pounder in comparison to Cynthia Calvillo. And, even Calvillo is a bigger 115-pounder as well. But I have a distinct inkling that Jessica Andraj will have the power advantage in this fight, that Jessica Andraj will be able to land her punches, land her combinations in this fight. And I'm going with Andraj for this one. Next up on fight night is UFC 266 heavyweight slobber knocker Curtis Blades versus Jairzinho Rosenstroke. You see how this card kind of lays itself out. You have a 115-pound fight in the female flyweight division. And then the next fight right after that, two big, massive heavyweights going head-to-head, and Curtis Blades and Jairzinho Rosenstroke both have had their fair share of trouble with current UFC heavyweight champion Francis Ngannou. Both of them have their back against the wall. A loss by either one of these guys, I think, is something that could really put them back in this fight. And Jairzinho Rosenstroke is somebody that I like Curtis Blades as well. I like both of these guys. It's a shame that one of these guys is going to have to lose. One of these guys is going to have to lose this fight in Curtis Blades and Drazenya Rosenstroke. Looking at the intangibles of Blades and Rosenstroke, I definitely look at the intangibles and the skill sets of both fighters and say that Blades obviously has a wrestling dominant, grappling style, and Rosenstroke doesn't. Rosenstroke's the striker. Blades is the grappler. It's a matter of, can the striker catch the grappler with something? And Curtis Blades is known to be caught in his few losses. He's been caught in those fights. So can Rosenstroke get it done? I think Curtis Blades recognizes how big this fight is for him. I'm going with Curtis Blades. I like to side with the wrestler. If there's a dominant wrestler in one end of the fight, one half of the fight compared to the other, I tend to go in that direction as far as the picking, order of that fight. Whoever has the better wrestling, I tend to side with. So for this one, I'm going with Curtis Blades, but this is a big fight for both gentlemen, no doubt about it. I see this fight as a winner moves closer back into title contention. The loser is really at the back of the line, because Blades lost to Ngannou twice. Blades is probably looking at the heavyweight division, and he's rooting for Ciryl Gane to beat Francis Ngannou. That way, maybe with a win over Rosenstroke, Blades could find himself in the title picture. But we'll see what happens with the whole actual title picture with Ngannou and Ciryl Gane. It's arrived. It's finally here. Nick Diaz, the return of Nick Diaz. Nick Diaz is one of the more charismatic fan favorites that I have seen in my time of watching mixed martial arts. I've been a mixed martial arts fan for a long time. So to see Nick Diaz back, and I really want to open the onion, I guess, on this one, or open the apple on this one. Bite into the apple on this one. Nick Diaz making this comeback is coming at a very unique time for the UFC, for the sport of mixed martial arts. There are few stars in this sport right now that are, still shining. Conor McGregor, we don't know when he's coming back. It appears as if, the Usmans haven't really put themselves over in terms of the fan favorite appeal. Jorge Masvidal got knocked out by Kamaru Usman. So, there's truly great fighters like Usman, and then there's guys that are, the fan favorites, the guys that have like these cult-like fan bases, and Nick Diaz is one of those guys. And for the sport to be missing a guy like Nick Diaz in terms of the weight that he holds, given the fan base that he has and that his brother shares with him, as the Diaz brothers as a package deal, I'm really happy Nick Diaz is coming back. I think it's been a long time coming. 6 years away from the UFC octagon. That's a very long time. Someone of Nick Diaz's talent inside the cage should not have been gone for that long. Someone of Nick Diaz's star power should not have been gone for that long. The only time I can look at a great fighter that took a really long time off and was able to succeed from it, we only have one example of that inside the sport of mixed martial arts, that is George St. Pierre. And I've said it time and time again, George St. Pierre, I think, is one of the greatest of all time. And George St. Pierre 50-45'd Nick Diaz virtually in every round of their fight. So it just goes to show you the levels to the game, the levels to the sport. And Nick Diaz is one of those guys that, he earned his way to a title shot in fighting GSP. Prior to that, he had an interim, slobber knocker with Carlos Condit. Wouldn't exactly call it a slobber knocker. It was more of like an interim fun chess match. And interestingly enough, as Carlos Condit decides that it's time to hang him up, Nick Diaz comes back. I find that kind of interesting. I'm not saying there's anything to that. It's just kind of unique and kind of a weird thought process that Carlos Condit's been fighting this entire time. Who knows how many fights Carlos Condit has fought in while Nick Diaz was gone. But to get Nick Diaz back is one thing. That's a victory in and of itself for the sport. But to get Nick Diaz back against ruthless Robbie Lawler, a rematch that is 17 years in the making, a rematch that sent Nick Diaz's career through the roof, and a rematch that forced Robbie Lawler to adjust, forced Robbie Lawler onto this path of the Strike Forces, the Elite XCs, essentially out of the UFC. That fight kind of put him out of the UFC, in terms of the picture. And people say, well, one fight, one loss, one knockout loss kind of took you out. In that time frame, it's really tough to understand that and wrap your head around that if you put it that way. But in that time frame, you really only had like a top 5 in every weight class. You didn't have a top 15 like you do now. The sport was so new and so fresh that there weren't as many qualified athletes competing in the sport. Now you have a top 15 in every division. You have a top 20 in every division. And that's not the case anymore. Or that's not, I should say, that wasn't the case then. Then you had a top 5. Nick Diaz was like the young, on the fringe top 5 guy that eventually found himself outside of the UFC with a loss to Carl Parisian. For those of you that have been around a long time, you remember those days. Fighting in the Mandalay Bay, fighting in the MGM on a big night in Vegas, and essentially fighting for the sake of the sport, to grow the sport. Now the sport's grown, the sport's here to stay. It's not going anywhere. And Nick Diaz at 38 years old comes back after a 6-year layoff. And I look forward to seeing that happen. And in actuality, if I go to the Nick Diaz record, he lost to Carl Parisian, and then he beat Drew Fickett as well as Koji Oshii, and lost to Diego Sanchez in a unanimous decision, lost to Joe Riggs in a unanimous decision. There's obviously a notorious story after that fight took place where they both fought each other in the hospital. And then obviously losing via unanimous decision to Sean Shirk. Nick Diaz at one time had a record of 11-6. Fought a Stockton, California MMA card against Ray Steinbeis, came back to the UFC, fought Josh Neer, Gleason Tebow, win, Takanori Gomi, no contest after Diaz tested positive for marijuana. And really unpacking Diaz versus Lawler, you can't talk about the Nick Diaz story without acknowledging the silly fact that Nick Diaz was largely held out of this sport due to athletic commissions throwing the gavel down on him and making him the whipping boy for what they didn't want as a part of combat sports, fighters using marijuana. Yeah, that they didn't want that. Now we've evolved as a society, thank God, and people can live their lives by choosing to use the drug however they see fit. And really, it's proven, clinical fact. I'm not a scientist, I'm not a doctor, but there's far more benefits to marijuana than there are to alcohol. There's far more benefits to marijuana than there are to cocaine. I go on and on. So to have Nick Diaz, 6 years outside the cage, and I mentioned Nick Diaz is 38 years old. 38 years old. That's 6 years away from the sport. That's his prime. 32 to 35 is like the last juice of a fighter's prime. I'm very curious to see what version of Nick Diaz we see in this fight. There are many reasons to believe, on one hand, that Nick Diaz will not show up the fighter that he once was. And then there are other reasons to believe that Nick Diaz will show up the fighter that he once was because he didn't take the damage over the last 6 years. I don't know what to think. I actually think that it'll be somewhere in between that Nick Diaz will show signs of his former self, will show signs of life. And the opponent that I touched on in ruthless Robbie Lawler, a veteran of the game, a former UFC welterweight champion, that's something that Nick Diaz couldn't accomplish during his quote-unquote prime years before the 6-year layoff on 2 tries, whether it was against Condon or George St. Pierre. Robbie Lawler's 39 years old. These guys are at the end of their careers. Robbie Lawler's worst loss is without a doubt to Nick Diaz. And I think Robbie Lawler is going to come into this octagon knowing that this quite possibly could be his last fight. Knowing that this quite possibly not only could be his last fight, but his best opportunity to go out with a win. over the man that destroyed him and basically embarrassed him. And I say that as a diehard, hardcore Robbie Lawler fan. Nick Diaz embarrassed Robbie Lawler in there, and Robbie Lawler, moments after that fight ended, he ran out of the octagon. He wanted no part of being there after that. Who could blame him? His strengths actually worked against him for the first time in his career, and it was in that fight on that prominent stage. As you know, Lawler and Diaz were two young guns in the sport, and now they're the two, war horses that are going in there that I think still do have juice left to put on a great performance. But Lawler is not the fighter he once was. He's coming off of 4 straight losses to Rafael Dos Anjos, Ben Askren, Colby Covington, Neil Magny. 3 of 4 were unanimous decision losses where the fights weren't really close. And then the third or the fourth loss in there that is a unanimous decision was a technical submission via bulldog choke to Ben Askren in a fight that had a lot of controversy. It didn't appear as if Lawler tapped in that one. It appeared as if Herb Dean just didn't notice that, the Herb Dean thought that Lawler's arm was falling down, and it did fall for a split second, but as soon as Ben Askren let go, it was like Lawler was perfectly fine. One of the weirder endings to a fight that I've ever seen in the sport of mixed martial arts. But Robbie Lawler is going to be coming into this fight like a bat out of hell. I think he's got a lot to prove in his own mind, not to me, not to the other fans, the other former fighters that he's fought. He's got nothing to prove, but he wants to prove to himself that he can go in there against Nick Diaz and get it done. And man, I'm having a real tough time picking this fight. I've talked to a lot of fight fans that I know, friends that have said they think Diaz is going to win. My dad thinks Diaz is going to win. I'm having a tough time envisioning how a fighter could get better by not competing in the cage. But we've only got one example. As I mentioned, we've only got one example of a fighter that has been able to do that, but it's the greatest of all time. It's like saying Wayne Gretzky was able to, retire, or Michael Jordan, I should say, was able to retire and come back after 3 years off trying to play baseball. Yeah, nobody else could do that but Michael Jordan. Nobody else could do that but George St. Pierre. I'm not quite sure, if Nick Diaz could be the second guy to come back after a long layoff and make this comeback. So, you know what? I'm going to go with Lawler for this one. I think Lawler can get it done. If he doesn't, I think it's the end for him no matter what, win, lose, or draw. Nick Diaz gets this one done. He's right back in there. Not really necessarily in title contention, but he's in there for another big fight. And a big fight that I think makes a ton of sense is Jorge Masvidal versus Nick Diaz. Not Jorge versus Nate again, but Jorge versus Nick Diaz. Nick has said that he doesn't want to fight anyone that his brother has fought. So maybe Nick Diaz is going to be in line for a fight with Colby Covington or something like that. We'll see. But I'm going with Robbie Lawler for this one. I'm just having a real tough time picking a fighter that's been gone for 6 years. It's really that simple. It's not even necessarily, me going against Nick Diaz in terms of his skill set. I'm just having a tough time going against a fighter that stayed active, regardless as to whether he's lost or not. Robbie Lawler's a warrior. He's fighting unanimous decisions. He's getting beat on unanimous decisions, but he's as tough as they come. So I'm going with Lawler. Next up on Fight Night, UFC 266 pay-per-view, Valentina Shivchenko and Lauren Murphy. To preface any statement I make about this fight by saying, with all due respect, I have a very tough time envisioning any challenger, any woman at 125 pounds in the UFC 115-pound division. I have a very hard time understanding how on earth anyone could take on flyweight 125. I keep getting those mixed up. Flyweight 125 division, I have a hard time figuring out. Let me go back here. I have a hard time envisioning any woman beating Valentina Shivchenko that's 125 pounds. I just don't. I don't see it. I look at that division. I know that there's a lot of hungry sharks in that division swimming in the waters of the 125 pound weight class. Lauren Murphy is a veteran of the sport. She's been around a long time. She really had to claw her way back into the UFC. I respect all of that. I credit to her for working her way up to this title shot. She deserved the shot because there really isn't anybody else to give it to. And that's a rare territory in any weight class for any champion to have achieved this much in such a short amount of time. Valentina Shivchenko has defended the belt 5 times after winning the vacant title in 2018. She wins that vacant title against one of the baddest females on the planet, Joanna Jędrzejczyk. Defends that belt against Jessica Ai. Defends the belt against Liz Carmouche. Defends the belt against Caitlin Chukagian. Jennifer Maia defends it against her. Defends it against Jessica Andraj with a TKO victory. She's run through quite a gauntlet of contenders at 125 pounds. And Lauren Murphy is the type of fighter that she's good at everything. She's not really great at any one thing. Whereas Valentina Shivchenko is great at everything. She can strike. She can wrestle. She can get you in a Muay Thai clinch that you have a tough time getting out of. She can submit you. She can put you anywhere she wants to. She's really a perfect fighter at 125 pounds in the female 125-pound weight division. I don't see anyone beating her, period, in my mind. That's not to say that it can't happen. That's not to say that, Matt Serra beat George St. Pierre and TKO'd him. Holly Holm knocked out Ronda Rousey when everyone was thinking that Ronda was invincible, but me. Who else? Michael Bisping beat Luke Rockhold when nobody gave Bisping his due heading into that fight. So anything is possible in this sport. You got tiny 4-ounce gloves on where if one shot lands right on the chin or right on the temple or right on the back of the ear, you could go down. Your equilibrium could fall off and you're done. I just don't see that happening. With all due respect to Lauren Murphy, I just don't see how she will be able to put herself. How will she be able to put herself in a position to beat Shevchenko? I just don't see it. Shevchenko is too good. She's too fast. She's too strong. I just simply don't see it. So with that, I have Valentina Shivchenko. I think Valentina Shivchenko is actually going to get a finish in this fight. Whether it's the first round or second round, you take the pick there. I see a finish in one of the first 2 rounds. Whether it's the first or second, I see Valentina Shivchenko getting her hand raised and still UFC flyweight champ. So moving on to the main event of the evening for the UFC 266 predictions video. To recap, I have Jessica Andraj winning versus Cynthia Calvillo. I have Curtis Blades winning over Jairzinho Rosenstroke. I have Robbie Lawler winning over Nick Diaz. And I have Valentina Shivchenko winning over Lauren Murphy. The main event of the evening, Alexander Volkanovski versus Brian Ortega. I am very pumped up for this fight. Alexander Volkanovski has been a champion that hasn't really been able to achieve that fan favorite allure that, Max Holloway was able to achieve, that obviously Conor was able to achieve, and obviously Jose Aldo was able to achieve this as well. I feel like Alexander Volkanovski hasn't really made himself likable to the fans, and even, 10, 11, 12 weeks of The Ultimate Fighter couldn't do that. And if 10, 11 weeks of The Ultimate Fighter can't make you likable and they make you less likable, that's a problem for not just Alexander Volkanovski, but for the UFC. Whereas Brian T. City Ortega, he's had his moments where fans like him. He's had his moments where fans think he's a little corny. But Ortega is a fighter that people want to tune in to see fight. Volkanovski in this one, heading into this fight with Ortega, it's not like, he's the A side of this main event. He's the champ. But it feels different. It doesn't feel like people will be tuning into this fight to see Alexander Volkanovski. They're tuning into this fight card to see the return of Nick Diaz. They're tuning into this fight card to see Valentina Shevchenko. And they're tuning in to see whether or not Brian Ortega can beat Alexander Volkanovski. I hate to say it like that, and I mean no disrespect in saying it, but I feel like it's just fact. The consensus that I've been able to pick up on within the MMA fan base all around the world is that Alexander Volkanovski is a respected champion based on his skill set, but he's not necessarily someone that you turn your TV on to tune into. That's what I'm trying to say. Tongue twister. You turn your TV on to tune into Ortega. You turn your TV on to tune into Max Holloway in this division. And Volkanovski, credit to him as a champ, but I really have a tough time calling him that. In my heart of hearts, I don't believe Volkanovski won those fights versus Max Holloway. I thought Max squeaked by the first time, and I thought without a shadow of a doubt, Max Holloway beat Volkanovski the second time. But what makes this fight interesting is that Brian Ortega fought Max Holloway for the title once before and was just completely ripped apart, just completely ripped to shreds. But then he fought Korean Zombie. Took a long time off. He fought Korean Zombie, Chan Sung Jung, and he looked like a completely different fighter. He looked like a world beater again, like he did prior to fighting Holloway. So is it a matter of just being flat on that night for Brian Ortega? Is it Max Holloway is that dynamic of a striker? Is it that Ortega really went in there with the same game plan on Holloway that he fought everyone else with? He just was beat by the better man on that night. And then he took that time off, kind of recalibrated the brain, got everything firing, got the juices flowing again competitively after that really tough loss that had to knock him down a few pegs. And to step in there against Chan Sung Jung and fight a fight like that, it was extremely impressive. It was one of the greatest bounce-back performances that I've ever seen from a UFC fighter. And from an MMA fighter, I should say. And I'm very curious to get inside the mind of a fighter, right? I always try to. And Ortega seems like mentally he is better than ever. Volkanovski seems confident in his skills, but mentally heading into this fight, I feel like this aura is around Brian Ortega as far as his self-belief and that he can get it done. Knowing how close those fights were between Volkanovski and Holloway, Ortega's probably looking at it like, man, if those fights were that close, I can get this done. And I think Ortega is going to get it done. I think we're going to have a new UFC featherweight champion, which would set the stage for an epic rematch between Ortega and Holloway, where Ortega's last loss was to Holloway. And we'll see if Holloway can crack that chin of Ortega's once again en route to maybe becoming the new champ after that. We'll see. But I have Ortega winning over Volkanovski. As crazy as that sounds, skill set wise, I definitely see Ortega having a distinct advantage in the reach department as far as the striking battle goes. Distinct advantage in terms of being able to keep his distance and land punches and kicks still. And Volkanovski, I think, is going to have to fight from very close range on Ortega, and I think that's actually going to work against him. So I have Ortega winning this fight. New UFC featherweight champion. Folks, that's all she wrote. I'm back. UFC 266 fight predictions. I'm very excited to watch this card on Saturday night. Cannot wait to see all the action take place with some epic fights on this main card. Obviously, Diaz and Lawler, I'm very excited for that. Shivchenko versus Murphy, Volkanovski versus Ortega, as well to open the card, Jessica Andraj and Cynthia Calvillo, and a heavyweight slobber knocker between two contenders in Curtis Blades and Drazenya Rosenstroke. So there you have it. My thoughts on the fights, predictions, breakdowns. For all things combat sports, whether it's mixed martial arts or boxing, tune in to the Thomas Take Sports Podcast, and I will keep you up to date, whether it's UFC fight predictions as well as post-fight reactions Sunday morning. Not only will I have a NFL pregame show for the Buffalo Bills Week 3 clash with the Washington football team, but I will also give you a post-fight reaction video to everything that goes down on Saturday night for UFC 266. So Saturday night, I'll be watching the fights, taking some notes, and applying those notes to the UFC 266, post-fight reaction video. Folks, I'm Ryan Thomas. Thank you so much for tuning in to the Thomas Take Sports Podcast. Hope you enjoyed the show.